I want to welcome everyone to this Inspirit Advantage webinar on secondary applications. We're going to dive into everything you need to know about secondaries, especially as they're hitting your inboxes right about now, and you are working hard on them. So we have some Inspirit Advantage panelists here with us today who work with our med school applicants on their primary applications. Secondary is really every single part of the med school application process to give you the best chances of getting into the schools that you want to get into. So for those of you that don't know, Inspirit Advantage is an admissions consulting company focused on the medical space, primarily med school, but also dental, nursing, PA, really everything in that sphere. And we're happy to have you all here with us today. All right, so today we'll introduce our panelists. We'll talk about what secondary applications are, how many you can expect to get. We'll talk about the components of your secondary applications, the common types of essays and prompts that you'll receive. We'll go over some tips for writing compelling essays, and then we'll open things up for a Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout the course of this webinar, feel free to pop them into the chat, and we will get to those at the end. And this is being recorded, and you will receive an email with the recording to this within the next day or two, so you can refer back to it. All right, so two of our fantastic Inspirit Advantage consultants are with us today. We have Neil and Ellie. Neil, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey guys. I'm Neil. I'm currently a PGY3 dermatology resident at New York University of Innsbruck for a while now. Previously was an admissions counselor at Michigan as well. So excited to meet you all and excited to do this webinar with you.
Awesome. Glad to have you, Neil. And Ellie, can you introduce yourself for us?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Ellie. I'm a medical student at Duke University. I'm probably going to go into surgery, and I previously went to UNC Chapel Hill, so I'm a little bit closer to you all than maybe Neil is as a resident, so hopefully both perspectives will really help you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both for being here. So let's dive into understanding what secondary applications are. Neil, it looks like you were frozen for a second.
Yeah, so I'll take the first slide here. Oh, hey, yeah. Secondary applications, as you guys may know by now, primary applications are sort of cookie cutter. I mean, every school gets the exact same primary application from you, and it's not necessarily personalized to each school, whereas every school does have a different mission that it shoots for in building its class. And the secondary applications are kind of that school's opportunity to get to know you just a little bit better through more personalized questions. So secondary applications are what the schools will send you after you've completed your primary application. In simple terms, it's another set of essays, unfortunately, that you have to write. But it is a chance for you to demonstrate a little bit more about yourself and give them a little bit more perspective on who you are as an applicant.
All right. So Ellie, you want to talk a little bit about the differences between primary and secondaries?
Yeah, so Neil said some of the main points here, but primary applications, unless you're applying to schools in Texas or abroad, you're going to fill out basically the same primary application for every school. For all DO schools, there's one, and for all MD schools, there's another. Secondaries are going to be specific to each school, and so they're going to come, as you all probably know by now, they're coming in July. Some of the DO ones come throughout June. And they're going to be specific to each school. They're going to send you a list of essays, short answer questions that they want you to fill out that are more geared at what they're specifically looking for in students for their specific school. And so I think that secondaries can be a little bit overwhelming, especially after you just fill out one for all schools, and then you just get bombarded with a separate application for each school. But hopefully this talk will help you kind of have some strategies as you're doing 1 million essays this month.
Yeah, just to jump in a little bit there as well. Just as my colleague said, there are going to be a ton of applications, certainly, but fortunately, some of them are sort of the same information. So you can kind of end up tweaking the applications just a little bit to personalize to each school, but hopefully it won't be a ton of extra work for you. So don't be too scared.
All right, so we're gonna just briefly go over what the primary application entails, just to use it as a jumping off point for our deep dive into secondaries.
Yeah, so the primary application, again, is pretty standard. It covers pretty much all you've done up to this point, at least through high school, through college, to get to where you are in applying to medical school. It'll ask about biographical information, your background. It'll ask about coursework that you've taken to date. And one of the, crown jewels of the primary application is the personal statement that everyone spends lots of time writing, trying to figure out how to tell their story as to why they're going into medical school. It's definitely one of those opportunities to show some sort of personalized aspect of who you are and why you want to go to medical school, and the secondaries will build on that. The activity section is a part of the primary application as well. I would advise taking that seriously. So it's going to be another way to kind of build on the personal statement and show why you've done some of the things you've done before you come to medical school. Instead of writing out just bullet points, for example, write out paragraphs and be thoughtful about it.
Ellie, anything else to add here before we move on?
No, I think Neil really hit on the main points. Something I will say, though, about the primary application is that you're pretty much laying it all out there. And so you can still draw on your activities and stuff that you mentioned in your primary when you're filling out your secondaries, but you'll be able to elaborate on them a little bit more when you fill out your secondaries. So they're not mutually exclusive. And I think that sometimes students might be like, well, I already mentioned this on my primary or in my personal statement, so I have to write a totally different essay. You want to write totally different essays, but it doesn't mean that you have to feel like you can't reuse an activity or a topic that you already mentioned, because you really are trying to give the admissions committees everything that you've done in your primary, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So for secondary applications, we've pretty much said this, but I think that as this slide says, they're different for each school, but Neil made a good point. Like there's going to be a lot of common themes. And so a lot of times you can use the same essays and tailor them a little bit to each school, which makes your life a lot easier. And it makes it more doable when you get a million essays to write. Some of the common topics I've seen, just to give you a few examples, are what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you? Why here? But which the why here essay, you do kind of have to write specifically for each school, but there's kind of a method to that as well. And other essays might be like, what do you see your practice looking like in the future? So there's definitely common themes, and I would encourage you to find those themes when you're filling out your application so that you can kind of minimize the amount of work you have to do and do more quality work, if that makes sense.
And one little tip I have, again, like Ellie said, for minimizing work, is you can reach out to people who have applied previously, because often the secondary applications don't change all too much from year to year for specific schools. So you could just reach out ahead of time and start working on them ahead of time to get the turnover a little bit faster. But we can talk about that in a bit as well.
Yeah, and a lot of schools might even post their secondary prompts somewhere, and just be mindful of the character count on those essays too, so you don't overwrite for something that you don't need to write too much for.
Right.
Yeah, so how much work are you actually going to have to do, I think is an important question to ask. So the number of secondary applications is honestly fairly predictable, in that you will probably get a secondary application from almost every school you apply to, so be prepared for that. The more schools you do apply to, say you're applying to 20, 30 schools, you're going to get maybe at least 15, 20, at the least, secondary applications to write. So set aside time for it, be prepared for it in the summer months leading up to your interview season. And it is important to get those turned around fairly soon, within like a week or two ideally, because they'll start processing your application and considering you for interviews after the secondaries are in.
All right, so we'll dive into the components of a secondary application.
So we've pretty much harped on the essays a lot, and that's the biggest component of the secondary application. Letters of recommendation, I think you all probably submit with your primary actually, but they're probably looked at with your secondary application, if that makes sense. So not something you necessarily need to worry about right now unless you're still working on your primary and still trying to get those letters of recommendation. And then an interview will come. So unlike the secondary applications, which you're going to get from almost all schools that you submit a primary to, with a few exceptions, interviews are very difficult to get. And that's going to be anywhere between August through really March. And so that's a little bit variable. And I think there's probably another webinar on interviews. But those are going to be like what the school will offer you after you submit your secondary essays. And then the fees definitely go along with the essays. Unfortunately, applying to med school is very expensive. And so you'll have a fee for each secondary you submit, unless the school's really nice. But I think almost all of them have fees. So those are the main components. Neil, do you have anything to add?
No, not at all. I think Ellie touched on all the major points there.
All right, so as Ellie mentioned, the essays are the big key component of this. So let's talk about the different topics you might get, and then we'll dive into specific prompt examples.
Yeah, so yeah, again, Ellie kind of preempted this, but there are definitely themes to the types of essays you're going to get on secondary applications, and that is a good thing for you because it means you can think of one idea to write about and broadly apply it often to multiple essays, which is nice. Some of those themes might be, quote, the diversity essay, what makes you a diverse applicant, what's unique about your application that makes you stand out, for example. The adversity essay, you know, that sort of distance traveled metric, like what did it take for you to get here? What obstacles have you had to overcome to make it here? And some schools might make this optional. They might not make it one that you have to fill out, but it's like, if you feel like there's a part of your life story that you want to tell here, then you can tell it. The why our school is going to be largely universal. You know, like, why would you apply to this school out of the hundreds of medical schools out there? What made you want to pick us? And why do you think you'd fit in here, for example, I think is important to answer as well in this question. And then the gap year essay, again, optional if you did take a gap year. If you didn't take a gap year, you might be skipping this essay. But it is important here, I think, to write about, you know, something substantial you did during your gap year, something you feel like was important to your application and that helped you grow as a student and as a future physician.
Yeah, a couple things. I totally agree with everything Neil said. These are definitely common ones that you're going to see. Another one in the past several years that's come up a lot is how did COVID impact your path to medical school? Anything, and I actually encourage students to kind of think outside the box on that. Even if, you know, you don't necessarily have to know someone that passed away from COVID. It doesn't have to be like as tragic as you might initially think. But anything like having to do virtual school, not being able to shadow as much, so maybe you have less clinical hours. Maybe you didn't get to go. Personally, I was applying to med school right at the time of COVID, and it totally changed my gap year plans. And so I could write about that. And just to kind of give admissions committees some context for why you did what you did during COVID, and if you would have done anything else if you would have had the opportunity. And then I also seen like two types of diversity essays. One is kind of like, how will you contribute to the diversity on campus? And the other one is, what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you? Those are like two of the main ones I see. And there's a little bit of a different approach to both, even though you can incorporate some of the same themes. Leadership is another really big theme I see, which kind of goes along with, why do you want to be a doctor as opposed to a physician or a PA, a nurse, a physical therapist. And hopefully you've reflected on that a little bit through your primary and personal statement, but that's another one to kind of be prepared for. And then finally, another one I see, which again kind of goes along with COVID, is just giving you space to explain any grades that might not be consistent with the rest of your application, or any gaps in your education. And so I would definitely take that space if you need, to kind of just make sure that you tie everything together, if there's any gaps that you have.
Great.
All right, so there's definitely some more specific prompts that schools will have. And again, there's going to be themes that track throughout all the secondaries. And so even if the questions are different, the themes will likely be similar. And so this is one from University of Washington. And again, the first prompt listed here is kind of going after that. Well, let's see. How have societal inequities in the US affected you or people you have worked with? This is one that I would say you would want to draw on your own experiences instead of just talking in vague terms. But you can start vague and then go into your personal experiences with societal inequities. Number 2 is exactly the thing we were talking about on the previous slide with diversity. And this one is aimed more at asking, how are you diverse? And this can be really anything. Maybe you had a specific major that was different from most pre-med students. Maybe it's an ethnicity or a race diversity component, or a sexual orientation component. There's so many different ways you can answer this question. You could be from a rural town. So definitely think outside the box on that. And number 3 is, obstacles. That's another common thing. If, what challenges have you faced? Have you ever had any failures, and what did you learn from them? That's very common. And then the social sciences and humanities, kind of explaining, why are you ready for medical school, and what have you learned so far?
All right, I think we have a couple more prompts
Yeah,
here.
and this is this is another set of prompts from UChicago, and I think even just going back to the last one, you can kind of start to see how the school's colors start to come out in the secondaries. Like UW is thinking a lot more about systems-based healthcare, for example, whereas UChicago is definitely a research-focused institution. And their second question, or third, I think it was the second question. Yeah, describe your research interests and share how our research opportunities will help you advance your career goals. So, you can kind of tell the type of students they're looking for by the secondary questions they're asking. But then they also have a twist on the diversity question, right? Like, what has prepared you to work in a diverse clinical environment? So how do you fit into a diverse setting? What makes you prepared to work with diverse groups of people with different backgrounds, with different roles, for example? Because UChicago does take care of a diverse patient population and has a diverse healthcare provider population as well. And then they have, I think almost everyone you encounter will have some form of the obstacle or adversity question, because everyone wants to hear what you've been through, if you have been through something challenging, or, if, be creative with this answer as well. Challenging situations are relative, to who you are and what you've done. But I think what's important in this sort of question is identifying how you rose to the challenge, how you dealt with it, and what you learned from it afterwards. So I think the resolution is very important in answering this question.
Yeah, I think all of that is super good advice. Something that you can start doing when you read these questions is, name one word that describes what theme this falls under. So the first one would be, diversity. The second one would be research. The third one would be obstacles, challenges. And the fourth one is like anything else. It's that type of question. So you can start to group your essays that way if it's helpful for you. as you're getting a lot of secondaries in, because then if you have, on one document, all of your diversity essays, you can kind of pull different sentences from different essays and be able to kind of do less work smarter. And then I think that Neil made a really good point about the type of school and kind of how their secondary is going to be geared towards this type of student they're maybe looking for. So, with University of Chicago, Duke, maybe Vanderbilt, some of the more research-oriented schools, they're probably going to have a question asking about research. Whereas, the University of Washington, UNC Chapel Hill, this bigger state schools that are really focused on primary care, they might have more questions like that. And so that's definitely something to be mindful of when you're filling out your application and answering other questions and trying to incorporate the school's mission into your answers if you're really interested in that place.
All right, so let's go into some tips.
So obviously the first thing you want to do, or the overall thing you want to do, is answer the question, answer the prompt. Don't dance around the prompt. Make sure that you're saying something concrete. And that brings me to the point 3 on this slide is the best way to say something concrete is to give a personal example or an experience or something that you learned, because ultimately the secondary is for them to find out more about you and not for you to answer in vague terms. Staying organized is also important because admissions committees are going to read so many essays, and so that you want to be very clear and outline what you're answering, use keywords so that the committee isn't confused and thinking you're kind of going all over the place with your response. Don't go over the word and character counts. That's an easy thing to do. I think a lot of times you can't even enter more than is allowed, but it doesn't look good if you don't even follow that direction. So definitely do that, and always read your essays multiple times before you submit. Have other people read your essays, whether that's kind of for advice or just for proofreading, because you don't want to start out with some errors in your essays. It can be really distracting too if you're a reader.
Yeah, I think all those points by Ellie are great. I think I'm going to preface my comment by saying I don't want you guys to lie on your application or embellish things, but you do kind of know what the schools are looking for based on the secondary applications and based on your research about the schools. And your job is to craft a narrative to help you get into those schools based on your past experiences in medical school and beforehand. So try to craft your stories to do that. So try to build your experiences or talk about your experiences in a way that answers the questions that they want to answer, and maybe tells them a little bit what they want to hear, because they want to build a class of a certain group of people, and your experience might lump you into that group of people. It kind of depends on how you frame it. So I think keep that in mind when you're writing your essays. Definitely don't make stuff up. Definitely don't embellish things more than they need to be, but personalize the essays. That's the point of the secondaries.
Yeah, that's a great point. Definitely don't lie. You don't want to be caught in a lie on your application, but like Neil said, you know what type of student the school is looking for. So if you're applying to that school, you might as well put your best foot forward. Something I do think is helpful is a general outline for writing an essay for a secondary. For example, if they ask, how will you contribute to the diversity of the class? Your first sentence should kind of be organized, kind of restate the question a little bit, and say something a little vague, maybe like I will contribute to the diversity of the class because I'm XYZ. Go into specific examples, and then go into a broader picture, like how will you use those qualities, or how will you demonstrate those qualities at the school and in medicine in general. It's never a bad idea to kind of tie it back to the school and to tie it back to why it's important in medicine, and that goes for all the prompts, not just one on diversity. So I think with practice that's kind of comes naturally, but it's a good way to kind of organize your responses.
So some common mistakes to avoid.
Yeah, so it's really important to get quick on these essays because the earlier entire application is submitted, the higher the
Really
chance
breaking up a little
a
bit.
lot of med schools operate on a rolling basis where they fill their spots as the earlier you get the interview, the higher a chance you have of filling one of their empty spots. So try to pre-write the essays if you can. Again, reach out to older folks who applied recently. They may have some copies of the essay prompts from prior that they can hand out to you if you applied to some of the same schools. Number two, like Ellie and I have stated previously, is you don't want to focus on only what happened in an event, like the facts. You want to tell the story around the event or the activity that you've done. For example, talk about what you learned, how you addressed, for example, a challenge, and what the resolution was. So kind of finish out the story arc rather than just displaying them with facts that they can read on your primary application. Again, we're going to harp on this because it happens, and it's a silly way to not get your essay considered by not following the word count. It's just such a silly thing, but it should be in your head. Just make sure you keep in mind exactly what their character or word count is. And again, the secondaries are personal. I mean, the personal statement is personal, but the secondaries are personalized to the school that you're applying to. So try not to be generic when talking about the school. Try not to say that every school is a pillar for innovation and academic research, and you'd be an excellent addition to that school, period. You know, you should tell them exactly why you think you'd be a good addition to their school. You should pull some facts from their website, from their mission statement, and try to tie that all together into something very personal that makes it feel like, yeah, you're exactly the type of student we're looking for this school, and this school is like built for you, basically.
Yeah, just to build off that, when you're writing why here essays, I think looking at the website is a must, which Neil just said. But some schools have specific programs like a primary care program, a rural medicine program, things like that. And if you're interested in that sort of thing, that's a great way to let the school know that you're seriously thinking about them and in that program, because those can usually be specific to schools. I know one school that has like a 3-year program for students that want to go into primary care, and that's pretty unique. So that's a great thing to mention. Another just general piece of advice is when you're pre-writing, it's good to pre-write kind of based on themes, but work smarter, not harder. So be careful not to try to perfect your essays before you even get the secondaries, just in case the word count changed or just in case the prompts are a little bit different. And make sure to kind of like not burn out too early, because after filling out your primary, that's really stressful. I mean, I hated filling out the primary and writing my personal statement. And so you need to take a little bit of time off before writing your secondaries. And if that's going to help you focus better, then just know yourself and kind of do what's best for you. And then finally, another kind of thing to avoid that I've heard from a lot of admissions staff is to just be careful about writing about privilege. So if you love to travel and you've traveled all over the world, that's great, but it might not be the best thing to write about because you want to make sure that you're not coming off as privileged too much to the point where admissions committees might kind of question your like emotional intelligence. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm happy to kind of answer more questions on that too.
Yeah, I actually want to add a quick point to that because I've read essays that have done similar things to this, and it just doesn't come off well. You know, like if your idea of a huge obstacle to overcome was not being the valedictorian in your class, for example, that displays a little bit of a lower level of emotional IQ because you should know, what sort of other challenges people face in their lives. So, just keep that in mind when you're writing about them. Don't force a challenge or don't force adversity into an essay. If you really have, little to write about, then don't embellish it or don't write something that would be construed as you not being in touch with the rest of society. That can happen. That happens a lot. So just keep that in mind.
All right, so that wraps up the content that we have for you. If anyone has questions, pop them in the chat or Q&A box, and we will we'll definitely answer those. And while we wait for a couple of those to come in, maybe we can just briefly talk about a couple of strategies that you both recommend to your students for their secondary essays, whether that's how to write these early, how to tailor responses in the best way possible, how to maximize your times. Any like hot tips that maybe we haven't covered yet or that you think are important and we need to say again?
I think something I wish I did when I was applying, which probably has been echoed throughout this whole webinar, is have some really solid answers ready for those common questions, especially the diversity one. That one's probably going to be asked in like 75% of the secondaries. And so having that ready to go, something you feel really good about, is super helpful. And just kind of a great thing to do if you're waiting on secondaries to come in that doesn't involve a ton of thought and writing is looking at those websites, making notes on each school so that when you are asked why you want to go to that school, you can pull up a document and already have notes taken on it. And you should really, try to be specific. And if you can't find anything you like about a school, then maybe question if you really should submit that secondary and apply there. So it's a good way to figure out if you should really apply to that school.
One quick tip I had was just to, be organized when it comes to all of these applications. You're going to get a ton rolling in simultaneously, and I think it's good to just have a checklist of, when things are due, when they came in, when you want to submit them, have deadlines set for yourself, so it falls to the wayside. And also as you write, kind of keep a bank of them in an easily accessible place. As it by the type of essay you wrote for each one. So if you have a bank of diversity essays, a couple of challenge essays, a couple of diversity essays that you can just pull from quickly for your next couple, it'll make your life easier down the line. And if you lose an essay, you're going to hate yourself because then you have to redo the writing for it later on. So I think just staying organized early is a good idea for these, to make sure you get them all in on time.
One question we just got is, I'm a white male and understand that my background skews my DEI prompt. However, DEI means a lot to me. So how can I echo this in my essay despite my demographics?
I can start with this one. That's a really great question. And I think when you're answering about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and you don't have necessarily diversity in race or ethnicity or gender, then think about your experiences. So what have you done in your life that is different than maybe what other people have done? Think about, was your undergrad major anything different than what others might have majored in that are more commonly applying to medical school? Religious diversity is another thing that you can think about. Did you grow up in a big family? Did you grow up in a small town? Grow up in a city? So just really think outside the box. Think about what makes you you and what makes you different than the person next to you. And that can really help write a good diversity essay without trying to make stuff up or sounding, bad to an admissions committee, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think those are all really great ways to demonstrate that. Like Ellie said, I think, the other thing you could do is try to prove it, right, by what you've done in the past. Have you been a part of diversity efforts in college? Have you taken leadership roles in pushing diversity, equity, and inclusion among organizations in your campus or outside of your campus, in the broader community you're a part of? So I think you can draw on all of those experiences to kind of show the admissions committee what you care about, what you've done, and how you'll bring that sort of spirit to their school as well.
All right, well, we'll leave another minute or two for some questions to come in, but just want to say thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thank you to Ellie and Neil. It was a pleasure having you both. No, I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else did as well. I'm sure that I know that this is a really stressful time for all of you. wrapping up your primaries, getting those secondaries in. So I hope that we can help out. And if you have any other questions, if you are not currently working with an Inspirit Advantage consultant, but want to learn more about how we can help you through, secondaries, interviews, feel free to go onto our website, schedule a consultation, and definitely sign up for more webinars that will be coming up in the coming months. And yeah, definitely let us know if you have questions. Before we sign off, Elle, Neil, any last tips, encouragement, anything to add?
You guys can do this. Keep track of your deadlines. Something I think is helpful is when you get a secondary, write down the date you got it. Turning them around in 2 weeks to a month is usually what I recommend. That being said, it's hard to get a million essays. And so make sure you're taking care of yourself throughout this process. And I promise it will get better. This is probably, for me, this is like one of the worst months ever of the application process. So hang in there, and then it'll pay off. So.
Yeah, like Ellie said, it can be a little brutal, but what's good about it is once you've done a couple, you end up being like this machine who can just crank out a bunch more, and by the end it'll take you like a few minutes to write an awesome essay, and you're going to feel like you're an incredible writer by the end of it too. I think one useful tip that I pretty much give for every single webinar I do is start early. I think you should start thinking of what you might want to write about early on before there's pressure to think about it. Kind of let it marinate. Think of some experiences you've had that might fit into some of these buckets of essays before they all come rolling in at once. And then you'll feel like you've kind of prepped in advance, and you'll feel a little bit of a lighter load start to actually write these. But yeah, you guys are going to crush it. We've all been through it, and there are a bunch of people who do it every year, and you guys are no different. So you guys will make it through all the same.
Great. One other question that just came in was, what's a fair amount, not too little, not too much, of experiences to include in your essays? Or is that something that's difficult to quantify?
I think that's a really good question. Something I think to be mindful of is it's always better to include less and elaborate more, or more quality than quantity. So we already like all the admissions committees have your activities list. They have your primary. So remember that. And if there's a specific experience that answers the prompt best, you can really only include one, maybe two if it's helpful. But make sure you go in depth about what you learned and specifics about that didn't show up in your activities list or your personal statement. But I think really using them to answer questions is a good piece of advice that you should always try to do to keep it from sounding vague. But yeah, quality over quantity for sure. Less is more when it comes to listing out experiences, and elaborating more is always better for secondaries.
Yeah, I mean, the essays will have different requirements for lengths that they want in their responses. So, for example, there are some essays that are like, write a biography about your life, and you're going to want to include a bunch of experiences in there. But for those smaller essays that are a couple of hundred words, I mean, if you think about 100 words as like a small paragraph, I probably wouldn't write more than one experience for every 200 words or so. I think that would be a little too stuffed. So that might be a good number to shoot for, but again, I think it's just based on what you feel like you need to talk about in answering the question that they're asking you. So I wouldn't really set a hard deadline for for yourself on exactly what number of experiences to write about, but really just make sure you're answering the question in its fullest depth.
All right, well, I think that brings us to the end today. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining. Elle, Neil, a pleasure as always to have you both. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day, and I wish everyone the best of luck with their secondaries. You've all got this, and you can refer back to this as well if you need additional motivation or tips and tricks. All right, bye everyone.